Detroit, November 23rd, 1981. The Fox Theater was half empty, and Marvin Gaye could feel every vacant seat like a missing tooth in a broken smile. He stood in the wings, his hands trembling slightly, not from nerves but from the cocaine he'd been using to stay awake for 3 days straight. The tour was supposed to be his comeback, his return to American stages after months of exile in Belgium. But the audiences were smaller than expected, the reviews were lukewarm, and Marvin could sense that his moment was slipping away. He walked onto the stage wearing a leather jacket that had seen better days, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. The spotlights hit him, and for a moment he felt exposed. Like every failure, every disappointment, every mistake was visible to the scattered crowd. He grabbed the microphone with both hands, steadying himself, and looked out at the faces staring back at him. Most were young, too young to remember when his voice had meant something, when his songs had changed things. But in the third row, slightly to the left, sat an elderly black man. He looked to be in his 70s, maybe 80s, wearing a worn suit jacket and a hat that belonged to another era. He sat alone, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on Marvin with an intensity that was unsettling. There was something familiar about him, something that made Marvin's chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't name. The band started the opening chords of "What's Going On?" and Marvin began to sing, but his voice felt distant from his body, like he was listening to someone else perform. The words that had once carried so much passion, so much purpose, now felt hollow. He was going through the motions, delivering a performance rather than sharing a truth. The audience was polite but not engaged, clapping at appropriate moments but never truly connecting. That's when he heard it, a voice from the crowd, low and gravelly, singing along. Not shouting, not trying to be heard, just singing. Marvin paused mid-verse and listened. The elderly man in the third row was singing "What's Going On" in a style that predated Motown, predated soul music as the world knew it. His voice carried echoes of field hollers, of work songs, of a musical tradition that stretched back generations. Marvin stopped singing entirely. The band continued for a few more bars before noticing that their lead vocalist had gone silent. The music faded, and the theater fell into an uncomfortable quiet. But the old man kept singing, his voice now clearly audible in the silence. He was singing "What's Going On" as if it were a hymn, as if it were a song his grandfather might have sung. "Sir," Marvin said into the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, would you come up here?" The audience turned to look at the elderly man, who seemed surprised to suddenly be the center of attention. He shook his head modestly, but Marvin was already walking to the edge of the stage, extending his hand. "Please," Marvin said, and something in his voice, a vulnerability that hadn't been there moments before, seemed to reach the old man. He stood slowly, his movements careful but determined, and made his way to the stage with the help of security guards. Up close, Marvin could see that the man's suit had been carefully maintained, but was decades old. His hands were marked with the kind of scars that come from a lifetime of manual labor, but his eyes held a clarity that Marvin had rarely seen in anyone, including himself. "What's your name?" Marvin asked, offering him the microphone. "Willie," the man said, his voice carrying easily through the theater's sound system. "Willie Thompson. I've been listening to your music for a long time, son." Something about being called son by this stranger hit Marvin unexpectedly. When was the last time anyone had addressed him with that kind of gentle authority, that kind of earned familiarity? Certainly not his own father, who had only ever called him boy in the most diminishing way possible. "Would you sing with me, Willie?" Marvin asked, and he realized he wasn't performing anymore. He was asking a genuine question, one person to another. Willie nodded, and Marvin signaled to the band. They started "What's Going On" again, but this time something was different. Willie began to sing, not the melody as Marvin had recorded it, but something deeper, something that sounded like it had been carved out of hard experience and survived decades of carrying weight. Marvin found himself harmonizing with Willie, but he was no longer leading the song. He was following, letting Willie's voice guide him into territories he'd forgotten existed in his own music. Willie sang about confusion and frustration, but his delivery carried a wisdom that suggested he'd seen these problems before, had survived them, had learned something from the survival. The audience, which had been restless and distracted, fell into complete silence. They were witnessing something that couldn't be planned or rehearsed, something that was happening in real time between two voices, separated by generations, but united by something neither of them could have articulated. Willie sang a verse that Marvin didn't recognize, words that seemed to be improvised but felt ancient. Been asking what's going on since I was a boy, son. My daddy asked it, his daddy asked it. Same question, different day. But asking don't make you weak. Asking makes you human. When the song ended, neither Marvin nor Willie spoke immediately. They stood together in the silence, and Marvin felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt understood, not admired, not celebrated, but understood. Willie looked at him with eyes that seemed to see past the fame, past the addiction, past the carefully constructed image, and recognized something essential. You carry a lot of weight, don't you, son? Willie said quietly, but the microphone picked it up, and his words carried to every corner of the theater. Marvin nodded, unable to speak. He felt tears forming, which shocked him. He hadn't cried in public since Tammy Terrell's funeral, had trained himself to keep his pain private, to suffer quietly. But standing next to Willie, he felt safe enough to let his guard down. We all do, Willie continued. But the music, that's how we carry it. That's how we make it mean something instead of just crushing us. The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the usual concert applause. It was slower, more thoughtful, the kind of appreciation that comes from witnessing something sacred rather than something entertaining. Willie handed the microphone back to Marvin and started to walk off stage, but Marvin caught his arm. Would you stay? Marvin asked. Would you sing a few more with me? Willie looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. They sang Inner City Blues together, and again Willie transformed the song, making it sound like a conversation between two men who had both seen too much, but were still trying to make sense of it. They sang Mercy, Mercy Me, and Willie's voice turned the environmental concerns into something that sounded like a prayer for forgiveness. They sang Save the Children, and it became a duet between hope and experience, between idealism and wisdom. With each song, Marvin felt something shifting inside him. He was remembering why he had started making music in the first place. Before the contracts and the expectations and the pressure to be a star. He was remembering that music was supposed to be a conversation, a way of connecting with other human beings, a way of sharing burdens instead of carrying them alone. The concert, which was supposed to last 90 minutes, stretched to nearly 3 hours. Neither Marvin nor Willie seemed to want it to end. The audience, many of whom had probably never heard of Willie Thompson and would never hear of him again, sat transfixed as they watched two voices find each other across decades of separation. But it was during What's Happening, Brother that something deeper occurred. Willie began to sing about his own brother, who had died in Korea, and his voice cracked with a grief that was still fresh after 30 years. Marvin, hearing that pain, began to sing about his own brother Frankie, who had returned from Vietnam broken and never fully recovered. They weren't performing anymore. They were mourning together, publicly, using the music as a way to share losses that neither had ever fully processed alone. The theater became a kind of church, a place where two men were bearing witness to each other's pain and finding, in that witnessing, a kind of healing that neither had expected. When Willie finally left the stage, he and Marvin embraced, and Marvin whispered something in his ear that no one else heard. Thank you for reminding me. Willie nodded and walked back to his seat, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been anything more than another face in the audience. But Marvin remained changed by the encounter. He finished the concert with a version of Let's Get It On that was slower, more contemplative than usual, as if he was still processing what had happened. After the show, Marvin asked his security team to find Willie, to bring him backstage. But Willie was gone. The ushers said he had left immediately after the concert ended, walking out into the Detroit night without a word to anyone. Marvin never saw him again. In the days that followed, Marvin found himself thinking about Willie constantly. He tried to track him down, asking around Detroit's music community, checking with older musicians who might have known him. But no one had heard of Willie Thompson, or if they had, they weren't saying. It was as if he had materialized for that one evening and then vanished. But the impact of that night lingered. For the remaining dates of the tour, Marvin's performances were different. He was more present, more connected to the material, more willing to let his vulnerability show through the music. Critics noticed the change, describing a new depth in his performances, a return to the emotional honesty that had made him great. More importantly, Marvin began to remember things he had forgotten. He remembered why he had fallen in love with music as a child, sitting in church and listening to his grandfather sing hymns in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the world, but somehow made that weight feel bearable. He remembered the first time he had heard Sam Cooke sing and how it had made him understand that a voice could be both beautiful and meaningful, that entertainment and truth didn't have to be separate things. He also remembered his own voice before it became famous, when it was just a way of expressing things he couldn't say any other way. Before it became a product to be managed and marketed, before it became a weapon to be wielded in industry battles, before it became a burden that he carried reluctantly. The encounter with Willie made Marvin realize how isolated he had become, not just from his audience, but from the musical tradition that had created him. For years, he had been focused on being innovative, on pushing boundaries, on proving his artistic worth. But he had lost touch with the foundation, the root system that had originally nourished his talent. Willie had reminded him that music was not just about individual expression, but about connection across time, across generations, across experiences. The old man had shown him that his songs didn't belong just to him, that they lived in the voices of people who found their own meanings in the melodies, their own truths in the lyrics. But as the days passed, the memory of that night began to take on a different quality. What had felt like a gift started to feel like a reproach. Willie's presence had shown Marvin what he had lost, but it had also shown him how far he had drifted from his authentic self. The old man's voice, so rooted in truth and experience, made Marvin's own voice seem hollow by comparison. He began to question everything: his recent recordings, his approach to performance, his relationship with his own talent. If Willie could transform Marvin's songs just by singing them with genuine feeling, what did that say about how Marvin had been singing them? Had he been sleepwalking through his own music for years? The cocaine, which he had been using to maintain energy and focus, now seemed like another barrier between him and authenticity. How could he connect with truth when he was constantly altering his perception of reality? How could he access genuine emotion when he was numbing himself against feeling anything too deeply? But stopping wasn't simple. The drugs weren't just recreational anymore. They were structural. They were how he got through performances, how he managed anxiety, how he silenced the voices in his head that told him he was failing, losing relevance, becoming a parody of his former self. The memory of Willie became both an inspiration and a torment. On good days, Marvin would remember the old man's voice and feel connected to something larger than his individual struggles. On bad days, he would remember Willie's easy authenticity and feel like a fraud, like someone playing a role rather than living a truth. Years later, when Marvin was in Belgium, struggling with addiction and paranoia, he would sometimes call friends in Detroit and ask if they had ever heard of Willie Thompson. He described the night in detail, trying to verify that it had actually happened, that he hadn't imagined the entire encounter during a drug-induced hallucination. But everyone confirmed it. The concert had been recorded by a local radio station, and bootleg tapes circulated among collectors. The duet with Willie Thompson became legendary among serious Marvin Gaye fans, a moment when the artist seemed to rediscover himself in real time. However, no one could ever verify Willie's identity. He remained a mystery, a man who had appeared, changed everything, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Some speculated that he was a retired musician, someone who had performed in the Chitlin circuit for decades without achieving fame. Others suggested he might have been a preacher, drawing on the same musical traditions, but channeling them into religious rather than secular expression. Marvin preferred to think of Willie as a messenger, someone sent to remind him of what he had forgotten, of who he used to be before the industry, and the expectations and the chemicals had clouded his vision. In his more paranoid moments, he wondered if Willie had been sent by someone with a specific agenda, but those thoughts usually passed, replaced by a simpler truth. Willie had given him a gift, and Marvin had been too damaged to fully receive it. The last time Marvin performed What's Going On publicly was in 1983, just months before his death. By then, his voice was damaged from years of abuse, his presence on stage erratic and unpredictable. But during that final performance, witnesses said he seemed to be singing to someone in the audience who wasn't there, harmonizing with a voice only he could hear. Some people who knew the story believed that Marvin was still singing with Willie Thompson, still trying to recapture that moment of connection and authenticity they had shared on a November night in Detroit. Others thought he was simply lost in memory, unable to distinguish between past and present. But those who listened closely to that final performance noted something that hadn't been there in years. His voice, damaged as it was, carried a weight of experience that felt genuine, a recognition of suffering that didn't ask for pity, but simply acknowledged what was true. Willie Thompson, wherever he was, had taught Marvin that music was not just about expressing pain, but about transforming it. Not just about carrying weight, but about finding ways to make that weight meaningful. The lesson had come too late to save Marvin's life, but it had reminded him, briefly, of what his voice was capable of when it was connected to truth rather than performance, to humanity rather than celebrity. In the end, the old man's greatest gift might have been showing Marvin that he didn't have to carry his burdens alone, that music was meant to be shared, that every voice was part of a larger conversation that stretched backward and forward through time. For one night, Marvin had been part of that conversation again, and the memory of that connection remained with him until the very end.